panel today. Oh, I will click that. So, hi, I'm Emily. I've worked at Groundwork for over 15 years, managing the Green Doctor service in Yorkshire since 2013. Since then, the team's grown from working just within the Leeds area to now working right across Yorkshire and the North East. My role in the last 3 years has changed, and I now work right across the Groundwork trusts in the north of England to develop the service into new areas of highest need and supporting the growth of the service in other areas of England too. We've also grown the service to deliver more specialist advice, including debt advice and retrofit assessments. We do have a talk in April about retrofit, so we will be covering some of that in more detail later. Also on the panel, we've got Simon, who manages our Green Doctor service in Yorkshire, which is one of the biggest teams in Groundwork. And in 2020-21, across the north, we distributed over £170,000 in emergency top-ups to people in crisis and saved 5,894 households over £210,000 on fuel bills. And that's through a combination of advice, switching and access to small grants. We've also got Dean joining us today, who manages our Green Doctor service in the West Midlands. Dean's also a qualified domestic energy assessor and a retrofit assessor, so he can bring some of his technical knowledge on implementing these large schemes in homes to today's discussion. So let's start with the problem itself. Simon, I'll start with you. Why do you think damp, mould and condensation is important, and how prevalent is it?
Hi everybody, thanks Emily. Well, I've been a Green Doctor since, well, over the past 7 years, and it's an issue which I've seen increasingly more serious, and I've seen very little that's been effective in terms of solutions. The two major reasons why I think it's a most important issue is in terms of health and costs. In terms of the health effects, so moulds, dampness, moisture in houses which is untreated can lead to mould growth. And mould is a living organism. It continues to grow as long as the conditions, the environments are favourable for it. If it's not tackled, it can lead to multiple health conditions. Some of those are respiratory problems, illnesses, cough, sinusitis, rhinitis, pneumonitis, which is a lung infection, and it can lead to the development of asthma. The studies where it's shown that there's been a 30 to 50% increase in the likelihood of respiratory illness for people living in damp, mouldy conditions. And as the UK has the third highest level of asthma rates in Europe, with around 1,400 deaths per year from asthma, it's quite a very serious issue. There was a report in 2004 from the Institute of Medicine which really raised the profile. It's not only people living in damp, mouldy conditions who have a higher risk with having a worse condition, but it's also known to cause conditions such as asthma. And this report in 2004 really made that link between previously healthy children and then children developing asthma as a result of living in damp, mouldy conditions. It's known to increase fungal, bronchial problems, throat, eye, skin irritations. I used to work with a young guy, an apprentice on Green Doctor visits, and he had eczema, and every time he went into a house which has damp, mouldy conditions, he had a skin irritation and he couldn't actually stay in there for very long. And we realised when we came out of it what those people were living with every day in their indoor, the pollution of their indoor air environment. People with rheumatoid conditions, it can make those conditions worse. And it's very more likely for people with weak or immune compromised conditions for those illnesses to get worse. There was a World Health Organization, quite a seminal report in 2009, which really raised the seriousness of the issue and the urgency for tackling it. And it produced some guidelines relating to indoor air quality. There's a slide there, Ned. Could you just put that slide up, please? This slide here is this is taken from a Green Doctor visit about 3 years ago, and it's a privately rented property. And here you can see the extent of the mold growth here on the landing, in the bedrooms, in the bathroom, and you can see it's an end terrace house, like I say, privately rented. And there's a family of 5 people living in there, with 3 very young children. They're waiting for, they've been on waiting for a council, housing association property to come up for quite some time. This has been reported to the landlord, and no action has been taken. And you can see visually, but actually being in that home and actually breathing those spores and those damp conditions and living in that every day is quite something else. And you can imagine the impact on the 3 young children there. So we were able to involve the private rented housing standards in that area, and able to get some support workers to try and help these people and raise this issue for the waiting list for the social housing. So that's just an example there. Thanks, Ned. In terms of like costs, so I mentioned health and cost being some major issues. So cost to NHS, for example. So poor housing is estimated to cost about 1.4 billion a year. That's a 2014 report. That's not only just down to damp mouldy conditions, but the dampness is high up on that list on the home health safety ratings system, where there's 29 hazards. Damp falls about number 4 or 5 in the hazards within the home. Cold homes is the first one. Cold homes and dampness being synonymous. So we're talking a lot of money in terms of cost to the NHS, and about 20 million working days lost due to poor health related to poor housing conditions, and a lot of those relating to damp. In terms of the cost to housing providers, so many of the people here will be related to housing associations or social housing in some way. I have an example from a typical housing association with 65,000 properties, and in 3 years they received 800 disrepair claims in 3 years. That's costing them £7 million. In a breakdown of those figures from those 7 million, that's compensation. And you've got 70% of these claims relating to damp mold condensation, 77% out of the 7 million. 15% of those costs is going to compensation, 20% is going on to the remedial works, and then you've got legal costs, 65%. So housing associations, it's a very serious issue in terms of not only costs in terms of repairs, legal costs, but also in terms of relationships with tenants. They can be strained, there can be a breakdown of relations because this issue is perhaps not resolved, or there's some dispute between what the cause of the issue is or how effective the solutions are. This could be costs related to customer service, complaints, and so on, the knock-on effect, and repeated visits from the repairs teams and so on. So very high costs. In terms of prevalence, there was a study in 2014 from the Energy Saving Trust, which was a self-reported study on mould growth in domestic homes. And that's about 30% rate of people suffering from mouldy conditions. In the US, that's higher, 47%. In England, that's so 30% relates to about 8 million homes, about 20 million people. We did a little study from the Green Doctors in 2019, a study of 888 homes. 43% had damp. This is for the prevalence. 101 homes that had damp, that had asthma. 76% had dampness in the home. In terms of like tenancies, private rent at the highest, 76%, damp mouldy conditions. Social housing, 47%. And in houses where there was dampness, there was 55% with people with mental health conditions. So having an impact upon mental health as well, not just physical health. And more prevalent in houses which are poor quality design, but even more so with low income. So in terms of fuel poverty. It's just a little study in 1999, just shows the difference between owner-occupiers being linked to people with a little bit more money, being more wealthy. 24% damp mouldy conditions. In social housing, that's about 56%. So fuel poverty, low income, very synonymous with cold homes, damp mouldy conditions. So yeah, those are just some of the reasons.
That's some really powerful statistics there. So it's really important to make sure that the advice is put across to tenants correctly and in the best way. So Dean, do you want to tell us what the current advice is to help prevent the issues?
Yeah, of course. So with current advice, if we skim over some of it, and we'll delve into some detail as we go further. But when residents typically raise a concern about damp and mould, it's usually the mould which is the trigger for that. It's very rare that people will just complain about the damp. It's usually because we're used to seeing condensation, every boil pan of water or run a shower, we see condensation on the windows. So it can become easy to ignore. And so the mould growth is usually the things that people react to the most. So what I want to do is give some advice around the handling of the mould first and go over what that advice looks like. And then we'll delve a bit further into what the damp issues look like. That being said, if damp is a primary concern that's being brought forward, it's probably because it's leaving stains or it's causing damage to the property or damaging soft furnishings and things like that. And if that was the case, I'd be very interested in getting out to that property at that point. If it looks like the damp or the mold may be caused by something other than condensation, the faster you can get out, the better, to confirm what the cause is for the issues that are raising up. Just touching on what Simon mentioned about some of those statistics. In the West Midlands, we work with a lot of people suffering fuel poverty, and we find that over a third of the people that we speak with actually report damp and mould as being their primary concern. So on top of all the other issues that they're dealing with, over a third will actually say the main issue we've got is damp and mould. So it's very much in line with this link to fuel poverty and how it can be a bit of a spiral for a lot of the time. So the advice about dealing with a lot of these issues early on can be imperative to making sure that the problems don't get larger and more difficult to deal with. So that being said, if we just look at the mould first, because the three things you need to think about when you're giving advice dealing with damp, mould and condensation is firstly dealing with any mould. That's the first thing you got to do. The second thing is you've got to advise on how to reduce the buildup of the condensation that led to the mould. And then finally, what you need to do is outline the steps taken to deal with the condensation that's going to occur, because there's always going to be there's always going to be some condensation in a property, but how you handle that and deal with it is really important going forward. So if we start with the first bit, someone's presented with mould, you've got to deal with the mould first. So I think it's important to understand what mould is. So very briefly, think of it, it's a fungi like mushrooms and things. It's made up of millions of colonies of quite dense tube-like branches like trees. This means that they can be quite resistant to damage and they can be quite difficult to actually get rid of. We're quite used to seeing on cleaning products 99.9% efficiency, but when dealing with mould, 99.9% isn't quite enough. That 0.1% will come back and it will get worse. And Simon previously just touched on it. If some advice is given about cleaning and it doesn't work, the chances of that advice sinking in a second time greatly diminish. The compliance with the resident can really break down. So although it can be straightforward to get rid of mould, it shouldn't be underestimated. It has to be done well. The mould spreads through the spores, and it's the spores that cause a lot of these respiratory problems that Simon mentioned. And it also means if it's cleaned poorly, or I've even seen advice about using sandpaper to get rid of the mould on the surface, that can make the whole situation a lot worse because those spores spread, and anywhere else that you've got a damp patch in the property is likely to start growing mould as well. So the best thing to do to kill the mould is use a proper fungicidal clean product. And then repair the surface with a fungicidal paint, because you can't just clean it. You need to repair the surface. It will be in that surface itself. And if you want to make sure it doesn't come back, it does need fully dealing with. Cleaning should be done cautiously. That's what I say. Simon mentioned some of the health side effects of mould in a property. Some people have very mild symptoms. Some people have no symptoms, they're quite resilient to it, but others can have very severe symptoms. We've talked about asthma briefly. We're talking lethal doses that can be present in properties. So it shouldn't be taken lightly, and only real small or mild cases of mold should be handled by a resident. If it's worse, I think it's probably best practice it's more advisable to get an expert to do a bit of an inspection and maybe deal with it as well. But using proper fungicidal treatments is the way to go with that. Second, you've got to then, once you've got rid of the mold, you've got to reduce the condensation buildup that led to the mold growth in the first place. So most people don't fully understand how easily moisture is generated in a property. We all know the obvious ones, like the shower running and drying clothes indoors and cooking pots and things like that. But residents often aren't aware of the amount of moisture that they put in the air, just the people. Simon showed that photo before with 5 people living in the property. That's a lot of moisture that's going to be generated in that property. And that's one of the that's why we often see them in bedrooms, often have damp problems, and you wake up with condensation on the window. People generate a lot of moisture in the air. So trying to help people understand that there's a lot of sources of this moisture and it's not all avoidable can really help to educate people on how it's not a problem that will be dealt with and solved. It's an ongoing thing that people need to take control of and stay on top of. The reason we often see it a lot in winter is because it's affected greatly by temperature as well. During the colder months, it's more likely you're going to get damp, particularly condensation, due to the cold surfaces that we can get during the winter. So it does tend to become much more of a prevalent issue during those colder months. But some of the advice that we would generally give to people is cover pans when you're cooking. Ensure that extractor fans are not only on, but they're working. Make sure they're actually working to how they're supposed to, particularly, when cooking and showering and things like that. Opening windows in wet areas is a really good one. In some properties, it doesn't matter how good your extractor fan is. If you've got the shower running for more than a few minutes, a large amount of moisture is going to be in the air during the winter. It's going to get very cold. You're going to get a lot of condensation. Cracking a window for 10 minutes can make a big difference. Keeping doors shut to wet areas. Those parts of the property that generate a lot of moisture, don't let it spread around the house to cold areas. Keep the doors shut. And the other piece of advice is really about the drying of clothes. And this can be quite counterintuitive because we know that there's a link between fuel poverty and damp and mold issues in properties. And ideally, you want to dry your clothes outdoors, get all that moisture outside. But during the winter, people have got very restricted options. So they tend to dry clothes indoors on radiators and such. And it's difficult to advise people to use a clothes dryer because of the high cost it can be to actually use one. So one of the things that we will do in the Green Doctor project can sometimes seem counterintuitive is that we will provide clothes areas for people. And some people say, well, you're encouraging people to dry clothes indoors. But what the trick is that people will often dry clothes on radiators. The motivation is, if I dry these clothes quickly, then I've got it out the way and I'll stop damp forming. But of course, that's actually the opposite is true, because if you dry clothes really quickly, that's a lot of moisture goes up into the air and it has to settle somewhere. Whereas if you dry your clothes slowly, maybe in a well-ventilated room, a room you can shut the door and open the window, that will stop a lot of that moisture getting into the air quickly and it will to escape before it has a chance to form on the walls and cold surfaces. So the use of clothes areas in those cases where, drying clothes outdoors or in a clothes dryer aren't feasible is a real good solution if people understand how it works, because it can seem counterintuitive. You think, I don't want to dry clothes over 24 hours because that'll give me a damp problem, when actually it could actually be the better of the solutions. The final piece of advice would be to keep the property adequately heated and evenly heated. We often find particularly bad damp and condensation and mold issues in properties that maybe have 1 or 2 spaces that aren't heated at all, or areas that are very difficult to heat. If you think mid-terraces that have the extensions on the back that often aren't the best insulated, they're usually very common to find damp and mold and condensation in, because they're often very difficult to heat. So how adequately you can heat a property will be a really important factor when considering damp and mold. And it just ties in again to fuel poverty, about addressing the entire issue and the underlying causes of that. So once you've done all that stuff, once you've cleaned the mold off properly and you've given the advice and people have started to put this behavior change in place, it's how do you deal with the residual moisture? Because like we said, there's always going to be moisture in the property. There's always going to be condensation somewhere. So how do you deal with it? Now, the best treatment is good ventilation. Good ventilation to allow air to move around a property. Most properties will have an undercut on a lot of the doors inside. So you've got a small gap that allows air to travel at a slow rate. So you get that movement. Trickle vents on your windows are good. We need to make sure they're open regularly. And if you haven't got any ventilation systems in the property, then it will have to be done manually. Open a window for 10 minutes a day. Will really make a big difference. That's often a sticking point, particularly when it's cold outside, asking people just open your window for 5 minutes. It's, you get a lot of resistance on that. But when you talk to people about how to heat a property more effectively, open a window for 5 minutes can actually help. If it reduces the damp in a property, it'll actually help keep the property warmer as opposed to making it colder. So again, it ties into this whole educational approach towards dealing with stuff like this. So air out a property at least once a day. Make sure your ventilation systems are open and working. So not just your extractor fans, but think the grates that you have on the outside of your house, the amount of properties that we go into that have damp problems and they've stuffed newspaper into the grates because there was a draft or something. And then obviously they have a damp problem, and then the property gets colder and colder because they've got wet walls and the problem starts to escalate. So again, it's information about those sort of practices that can be good. The other thing is keep your furniture away from cold spots. You're going to have some moisture in the air. If you've got some cold spots, maybe you've got a wall that's maybe very exposed to the wind, make sure your furniture isn't pressed up against it. You don't want your sofa pressed to there, or you don't want your clothes against the cold wall or the radiator being blocked or anything like that. They can always be really good practice to make sure you're not creating those environments where damp and mold can take hold, because that's usually where you're going to find it. Corners, behind furniture, particularly blocked radiators can be a big one. They'll create a lot of issues around the rest of the room as well. In particularly damp properties, maybe a dehumidifier would be required. Now, obviously, there are costs to that, the running costs, but in particularly difficult circumstances, it may end up saving money, keeping a dehumidifier running in particularly damp areas, particularly one of the modern smart ones that can detect how moist the air is and adjust itself accordingly. Could be a circumstance. It's rare, but they do come up. And one of the best pieces of advice I can give to people who are dealing with the residual condensation is when you see it, when you see condensation forming, when it appears on your windows in the morning or it's on your bathroom window after a shower, wipe it down. That's moisture that's no longer in the air. Opening a window isn't going to get rid of it. It's already become condensation. Taking a couple minutes with a cloth to wipe it down and dry the surface, you can easily dispose of that water and you're going to prevent mold, that opportunity to take hold in those places. And it can make quite an immediate effect as well, because particularly on windows, mold can grow very quickly on a wet window, in the corners and things. If you're regularly wiping them after each time you use the wet areas, you'll see the change almost immediately. It really does make a big difference.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Dean. There's some really fantastic advice in there. I'm definitely one of those individuals who's guilty of blocking up an air vent at one point in my property. So, which is why I was smiling when you said that. So given there's all that fantastic advice out there, why is the advice failing?
I think when failure occurs in advice, it usually occurs really early on, and it might even occur at that point where you're identifying the issues. Like I said, most damp issues will be reported because of the mold growth. In those circumstances where mold isn't the primary concern and it's damp, it would ring alarm bells for me that it might be down to something else. And this can happen in modern properties as well. It's often a misconception that because modern properties are very efficient and they're very more easily to heat, that they're not going to have damp problems at the same rate. But modern properties can really suffer with ventilation because they're built to be quite airtight. There was a study that showed that 95% of new homes fail to meet the required ventilation requirements because they're so energy efficient and airtight, which is great for heating, really bad for condensation. And so it's sometimes important not to jump to the conclusion that it might just be because of condensation, and you need to get out and identify it. And the problem can be, if a problem's identified incorrectly, the advice that you give would be different. And if you give advice that tends not to be effective, then the compliance of the residents will really drop. And some of the cases that we've seen that have escalated to a point where, like the photo Simon shared, where they've got that bad, it's been because there's been a breakdown of communication because some advice was given, it didn't quite work for them, the issue didn't go away. And there's almost like, sometimes it can be a bit of a protest that, well, no one's dealing with it, I'll leave it. And it gets worse and worse and worse. And like the damp problems that you saw in those photographs, cleaning it isn't going to do the job. You know, that's a case where you're going to have to pull the plaster off the walls. You're going to have to clean behind the walls. It's a big remediation job. It's going to be very costly. And a lot of the time it all starts because if the problem isn't identified accurately, the advice won't be effective, and there can be a breakdown of communication that can spiral into these sort of things. Even the simple cases where it's just a small patch and it needs cleaning, one of the most common things used, well, there's two. One of the most common is to use bleach. So water down some bleach, use that, or the other is vinegar and baking soda is the other one, which do work. They do kill mold, but the problem is a lot of the surfaces where this mold's growing are quite porous. You know, if it's either plasterboard or brick, something like that. And cleaning the surface won't get rid of it. Like I said, 99.9% isn't enough. It has to be gone. And so often the only effective treatment is to use the proper fungicidal ones, which are more expensive. But if you give advice to use bleach and it comes back, next time you suggest it, they're just going to say they're not going to comply. And so that can be one of the other sort of trigger points as well, where people will often that compliance will break down. If extractor fans, that's another one. Extractor fans, even when working over time, because they're mechanical, they can lose a lot of their effectiveness over time, and they will need replacing at some point to stay effective, particularly as you can imagine a lot of the housing stock we have can be quite old. And over the years, we've improved it and added things and made it better and more efficient, but the ventilation hasn't necessarily improved. And that's when you can see a lot of damp and mold problems happening as well. So it might actually, you get to a point where if the problem isn't going away, there's more action that needs to happen in order to solve those issues. So in summary, I'd say most of the failings occur in the identification first, and then trying to make sure the advice that is given that's effective to deal with that specific issue. It comes down to time. You know, the best way to deal with it is to do a site visit, but it's not always possible to do that.
That's great. As we're chatting, do feel free to pop any questions for Dean and Simon into the chat as we're going along. So Simon, how do you think we can better communicate all of this advice to households?
Yeah, there's a lot of good information there, and especially in terms of like obviously the prevention, the early prevention is critical to avoid that disruption later, because there's the most effective solutions there are the fungicidal solutions, which are long term and require various stages of treatment. So yeah, definitely prevention. In terms of like communication, so I think what we'll be doing here is highlighting the issue of how serious it is. So it's to take the issue seriously, and to think as a housing provider, you know, how perhaps you would want to be treated as a tenant, and if you were suffering in your home from damp, mold and condensation. In order to communicate your advice better, I think from a housing provider's point of view, then you would first look at perhaps what your responsibilities as a landlord are, if those are being fulfilled initially, before we look at what the tenant's behaviour is. So in terms of like the building structure, design, the adequate heating, ventilation. Are there any repairs that need doing? And as mentioned, taking seriously damp should be one of the moisture in the home should be one of the priority issues for like repairs teams. Are there any individual, so taking into the individual circumstances of the tenants involved, are there any health problems particular for those particular tenants which would require more urgent treatment, or that would be made worse from damp mouldy conditions? Is it a cause of low income, fuel poverty? You know, there's over the years we've seen this ping pong, this kind of revolving door kind of scenario where it comes from the tenant. There's a complaint made, or there's a repair request remade for damp mold conditions, and it's coming back and they're saying it's a behavioural issue, and again, and there's a solution, like Dean said, perhaps for bleach, but it's not getting rid of the problem completely, and it comes back to the housing provider, then goes back to the tenant, first to make sure that the housing provider is doing all that they can, and then look, is this a behavioural issue after we've looked at all the other possible things. So it's, I think, very much kind of a sharing process, engaging earnestly with the tenants and taking their issues on board seriously. And I think from the outset, there's a responsibility from both sides. You know, if we're talking from housing provider and from tenant, there's a responsibility, like I mentioned before, for the housing provider to make sure the buildings and the ventilation, the heating is adequate and the repairs are done. And there's also a responsibility from the tenant side to ensure that they're managing the heating, the ventilation, the water, and they're doing things that doesn't encourage dampness and growth at the same time. So I think if there's a clear definition of what the responsibilities are from landlord and tenant from the outset, that could be helpful in some ways. In terms of like actually communicating that those tips that and the advice that Dean has just gone through there, behavioural change advice is a science within itself. How to impart the information, how to make that information understandable and transmissible to all different people. So I think there we've got to working with trusted partners. There can often be an historical barrier between housing provider and tenants in terms of, you know, that we mentioned before, a communication breakdown or a lack of trust. Or so I think working with intermediaries, trusted intermediaries, can be very helpful to get that message across from both parties, to taking that issue seriously. Breaking down those historical barriers, working with tenants on their specific cases, getting that message over in different ways, perhaps in videos, perhaps through information leaflets, via education, monitoring progress. So perhaps if we come and we identify an issue, we provide a solution alongside with the tenant as a shared experience, like a shared journey almost in some way. And then after a certain period of time, when hopefully that's had some effect, then we will go back and we'll monitor that progress. So it's not just a one-off kind of visit and there's no more engagement. So there's some monitoring of that progress. So they know, tenants know that the housing provider is on board and their issue is being taken seriously and is being monitored. Because as we've seen, if it's not, the impacts are huge on health and the housing provider as well, and nobody benefits. I think so, yeah, some of those some of the ways in which we could perhaps communicate that advice better, and perhaps using some technology as well to back up some of that advice that we give, so we make it more tangible in some ways. So I mentioned education and some of the things that Dean mentioned earlier of the tips, to make it known that a tangible figure, an average household will produce 14 litres of water from daily activities, from drying clothes, cooking, bathing, to make it more tangible. So to know when mold growth occurs or what type of humidity in the home. So around 70% humidity, you're going to get some mold growth. So perhaps you want to be aware of the humidity levels inside the home, whether that could be provided, that could be taken from the tenant themselves, or that information could be provided from some kind of system or some device within the house that would enable the tenant to understand what's going on there in a tangible way. approximately 50% humidity is a good humidity level to prevent mold growth, for example. So having that information available, I think, is quite helpful in terms of like communication.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of time, so there's a lot of really good questions in the chat now. So I think it might be worth us just hop into the chat, unless there's anything you wanted to add, anything critical you wanted to add in right now. Is that all right? So
in terms of, sorry, go on, Blair.
No, it's all right, go on.
It is about communicating that, but it's that information being integrated into systems. So that's through the housing officers, that's through the housing provider, if that's through an intermediary. And just to say just briefly, but making every contact count, I think that's a really good approach. So each person that's engaging with the tenant, whether it's the repairs team, the housing officers, the customer services team, is also looking at a wider remit beyond theirs. So in terms of like damp mold condensation, they're identifying that, and they have referral pathways to specialist organisations who can help with that kind of thing. Incorporating it into like new tenancy schemes. A new tenant that takes over a property, they have information and advice about how to reduce damp mold condensation and what the impacts are if they don't, and again what their responsibilities are as a tenant. I think those are important things to do. And similar with like void properties, you can go into void properties before the relet, and then there could be an assessment there for damp mold condensation, and then you're setting off on a good grounding, you've got a good footing before the issue may take place. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks for that, Simon. So I've just been looking through the questions. We've got quite a few that are sort of touching on the most effective mold sprays and mold treatments. So whilst without product placement, can you recommend some of the better products to use to tackle it?
Yeah, I think someone mentioned about a mold spray, and it was basically diluted bleach. Like I say, a lot of these, they do work, but they're intended to be used on sort of hard surfaces like tile and things like that. So that's often used in bathrooms. If you've got a sealed surface, a bleach product will work. A lot of them are like spray and leave. You don't even have to wipe them away kind of thing, and they will work. But they are temporary. And they're not, if you don't fix the issue of why the mold was growing in the first place, it's not going to be very effective long term. It'll just be constantly spraying a bleach product into your property, which might have its own, health concerns. So it's specifically the ones that are marketed as fungicidal are the ones that are key, because they will actually break down the fungus itself rather than just sort of kill the surfaces off. And the fungicidal ones will also work on more absorbent and softer materials like wood. But like Simon, he briefly touched on, I think, it does require a proper treatment, and it can sometimes mean going back a couple of times over a period of weeks to make sure that it's fully taken hold. But don't forget to repair the surface. A lot of the time we'll clean it, but you need to then make sure you repair the surface with a fungicidal paint if it's a wall, for example, or you will get some growth coming back.
I've got a question about moisture absorbers and how effective they are.
Well, I mean, Simon mentioned 14 litres generated. A moisture absorber at most might get a litre, and it'll take a week to do it. I find we had this question come up somewhere else actually, and the thing about moisture absorbers is that they do work for what they're intended to do, and that is small spaces that have high humidity, they can help. For example, if you've got like a walk-in cupboard or something like that can often have damp. For small areas or pantries, things like that, they can be quite effective. But for the amount of water generated by the average person in the average size room, it's not going to be enough on its own. They're good as a secondary, but it wouldn't be my primary attack, as to say.
Yeah, no, that's good. We've got a really good question about air source heat pumps. So, Jessica's put in, they're doing some whole house retrofits for properties that are solid fuel. Customers don't want air source heat pumps due to having asthma. What's the best way to advise customers that a lower constant heat's better than short bursts of intense heat?
I suppose it comes down to what the the issue that they have is I'm assuming from how the question was phrased that the concern is that they don't feel it will get warm enough for what they need.
Yeah, or it might, I guess I'm thinking back to our last session, it might also be a cost, because there's a perception that constant heat is more costly than the short bursts.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I have heard concerns about any of these sort of a lot of this new heat, because it's new, people are concerned about it. It was the same with smart meters. When smart meters came out, people were very concerned about them, and there's a lot of pushback. I think it's a difficult one, because you do basically just have to provide as much information as possible and provide the answer to the question that they've got, because it is a common battle that we face. Even with gas central heating systems, it's the same issue, trying to convince people to keep the property heated for a longer period of time. Keeping that temperature even and nicely evenly heated is cheaper than whacking it up to full and then turning it off. And it's providing that education and that guidance. I find actually smart meters are a really good tool to use for this. If you get the in-home displays, and even if they don't trust you 100%, you can usually convince them, try it for just a week. Do it my way for a week. And then you'll see that I'm right. But with the air source heat pumps, you've got that extra barrier of it's a new technology that people aren't familiar with. So the more information, the better. But it's just making sure you've got the right answers to the right questions when they ask them, usually.
Yeah, brilliant. We've got a very interesting question that Georgina's put in about cultural bathing and how best to tackle that in information given to households for landlords. I'm guessing that comes down to the extra moisture that you've got with extended bathing periods.
I think it's just being more proactive with them, with the things you can do to reduce the production, reduce the spread, and deal with the production when it arises. So a lot of them wiping down surfaces, keep well ventilated areas and things like that. That would be my piece. Simon, have you got anything to add on that?
No, pretty much similar actually, Dean. I think it's just highlighting and educating, isn't it, what the are of not doing anything, but also taking into account also different people's cultures and considerations and needs. But then that's in the overall grand picture scheme of things in terms of health and costs and impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicola's asked, is there a correlation between overcrowding and damp mould condensation? So I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Simon, with that example that you showed. So she's got a family of 8 living in a 2-bed flat that are on a waiting list for a larger house. Have we just lost Simon?
Maybe. Yeah, it is. The more people you have in a property, the more moisture is going to be generated, not just from them living in it, which is a lot, just from breathing, there's quite a lot of moisture, but everything that those people will do, it's definitely going to compound the issue. The difficulty is that the advice remains the same, just more of it, more proactive action. But it's usually a ventilation issue. At that point, where if you've got overcrowding in a property, there's very little you can do to prevent it, because the property is just not designed to ventilate that much air to accommodate the number of people. So if you have an overcrowded property, I can almost guarantee they're going to have a damp and mold problem. And it's very difficult to treat. The only way to solve the issue is to prevent the overcrowding or make the property more suitable.
Yeah, and that is quite a lot. 8 people in flats. Yeah, that's a lot.
I guess, occupancy.
Yeah, that's all right, Simon. Don't worry.
Sorry, I just lost connection.
I guess linked to that, there's a question that's about ventilation. So, have you got experience of balancing retrofitting and ventilation? That's probably a good one for you, Dean.
Yeah, during a retrofit assessment, so before any improvements should be made, a retrofit assessment takes place. And part of that is to actually evaluate what the ventilation is like. Now, what's supposed to happen is you do your retrofit assessment, and the ventilation systems will be assessed to see if any improvements you make to that property will require improvement in ventilation, to make sure that it all gets done. The problem often occurs with retrofit that the funding is usually put forward first. So the funding for a new heating system will come in before anything to fix the secondary things that need doing as well. And that's why I mentioned earlier that a lot of newer properties or older properties that have been upgraded through the years will have this issue with ventilation, because it's very important that the more efficient you make a property, the chances are the better ventilation you're going to have to ensure for that property. Did that answer your question? Because I forgot what your question was.
Yeah, experience of balancing retrofitting and ventilation. So basically, you've got to do the two together. Yeah,
ventilation's an integral part of any retrofit that it's done in the property. Anytime you change the fabric of a building, you need to look at what the ventilation is. I did notice there was a question about nest in loft.
Yeah.
Again, it shouldn't directly affect it, but if it affects the ventilation of the property, if it's blocking the roof rafters, it's definitely going to lead to issues with damp and mold and cold spots and things.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. I'm conscious of time and I don't want anybody to be late for any of the plans that you've got. So I can't spot any more questions that have cropped up in the chat. So I think we'll finish it there. So Ned, can you put up the final slide for me? So thank you, everybody. I hope we've answered all of your questions. You will have my contact details. I'll be sending another email out after this is finished so that you've got the YouTube link if you'd like to watch it again, or if you want to share it with any colleagues. My email address is also on the screen for you there. So our next webinar session is on, I can't see that on my screen, the 26th of April at 12 o'clock. So we're going to be covering retrofits. So you've got an opportunity to ask any questions, whether that's about the process, different regulations, or any specific retrofit measures. So we've got some of our retrofit assessors lined up to answer questions on that session. We're also really keen to hear of any other topics that you might be interested in us covering, because we are planning to continue running these over the summer period. So do let me know if you've got any key topics you want us to discuss. And again, if you've got any really good case studies or any work that you've done and you want to share that with others, we would love people to join us on a panel. So again, just let me know. So I will draw us to a close there so we're not running late. Thank you very much for coming. I hope that was useful for everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.